everywhere, UN forces needed to find a better way to put pressure on the Reds. So they turned to their most obvious advantage: air power. If there was one unquestionable imbalance in this war, it was UN air superiority. From the first day of UN intervention in Korea until the final day of battle, American aircraft pulverized North Korea ceaselessly from above. Most planes in the UN fleet were built during World War II, like the B-29 super fortresses that still dominated bombing operations. But a new generation of US fighter planes was gradually being introduced and kept pilots a step ahead of the enemy. Jet planes like the F-86 Sabre ushered in a new era for aerial combat and quickly became the air war's main attraction. They replaced slower fighters with a more aerodynamic wing design, and they were faster and deadlier than anything that came before them. With the world's greatest aces in their cockpits, UN jets ruled the skies. In 1952, UN air power reached its peak strength. The U.S. Air Force had nearly 1,500 planes flying missions that year, and more from the Navy, Marines, and other UN squadrons. That summer, a massive show of force was unleashed over North Korean skies, meant to force the communist hand at the peace table. The Air Force descended on a remote corner of North Korea just below the Yalu, where the country's largest industrial targets were hidden. But this was where the Chinese had their only strong fleet of fighter planes, so UN pilots were prepared for anything. On June 23rd, U.S. dive bombers and jets launched an intense string of attacks on several major industrial centers. The primary targets were hydroelectric plants. Air Force Sabres flew top cover on the lookout for Chinese MiGs, while bombers moved in and hit the plants. The attacks were swift, sudden, and perfectly executed. When the smoke cleared 2 days later, 90% of North Korea's electrical capacity had been destroyed. These airstrikes would stand as the most vital of the war, and they didn't escape the notice of South Korea's leader, Syngman Rhee.
Your planes hit enemy military centers. They hit the communist columns. Everybody knows that American planes played the most important part in this war.
Air Force barrages would continue to pound the communists until the day the armistice was signed. But while they gave the UN some leverage at the peace table, they weren't quite enough to close the deal. To do that would require a whole new dealmaker. Korea was the hot-button issue of the 1952 American presidential campaign. With voters running low on patience, the Democrats faced an uphill challenge against the Republican nominee, legendary General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike had commanded Allied forces in Europe during World War II and had retired earlier in the year from America's most prestigious command. Even MacArthur played second fiddle to Ike. Harry Truman had served as president for more than 7 years and decided not to seek another term. As the Korean conflict entered its 3rd year, Americans were afraid the war would drag on forever and wanted a leader who could end it quickly. In a late October stump speech, Eisenhower managed to put their fears to rest.
I shall go to Korea. Only in that way could I learn how best to serve the American people in the cause of peace.
After his victory, President-elect Eisenhower made good on his promise. He donned army fatigues and met with troops near the front lines. He ate rations with privates and listened to their thoughts on ending the war. There were rumors circulating in the press that Ike would use the atomic bomb to force an armistice, as Truman had in World War II. To capitalize on the speculation, Eisenhower started to drop hints that this was a real possibility. Up to this point in the war, the Communists had been emboldened by the UN's self-imposed limitations. But they took Ike's nuclear warnings seriously. Just 3 months after Eisenhower's inauguration, the Chinese cracked. They sent a letter declaring their desire to end the war. But the war's finale would be as tense as its beginning. The armistice took another 4 months to iron out. Along the front, soldiers on both sides knew the end was near and wanted to go out with the best field position possible. Hostilities broke out across the peninsula in last-ditch attempts to gain ground. The armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953, more than 3 years after the war began. It divided the peninsula along the front lines, in effect giving the UN a small victory. In the field, artillery blasts kept rolling for another 12 hours until the agreement took effect. Then, all was quiet. More than 3 million casualties fell on the hills of Korea over the war's 3 years, counting civilians and servicemen, wounded, killed, or missing. The land of the morning calm had been ravaged by death and destruction. With participants from more than 20 countries fighting on one side or the other, this struggle, remembered by most as a minor stalemate, was in fact a world war in its own right. The global fight against communism that would last for 40 years began here, in the wilds of this small Asian peninsula. But unlike the Cold War it provoked, the Korean War goes on to this day. Soldiers from both sides still patrol the armistice lines in Central Korea. Things there haven't changed all that much since that spring of 1950. Today, Korea is the only place in the world where a war is officially being fought. But despite Korea's lingering ambiguities, the men and women who served there were among the bravest and most selfless warriors in military history. Their legacy is one of courage in the face of despair, conviction in a time of indifference, and persistence in the face of overwhelming adversity. Unto these brave soldiers, we owe our deepest gratitude.